Hi, class. Welcome to lesson 3 of Unit 4. Uh, for many of you, the last couple of lectures have probably been pretty dry because I've been talking a lot about politics, I've been talking about economics, and I haven't really been talking much about what it's like to actually live in the United States during this time. I haven't really emphasized the human aspect of American history during the early part of our country's time. And in this lecture, I am going to talk about what it's like to live during the antebellum period. I'll explain what the term antebellum means in a moment, but just note that this is going to be one of the more uh, human lectures that I talk about, where I talk about what it's like to be an average person during this time. And so, to make this lecture interesting, think about what it would be like to live in the place of the people that I'm talking about during this time. So this will be the more human, more biographical lecture of this unit. So during the antebellum period, the North and the West and the South are going to be increasingly different in terms of their cultures. You will see differences popping up, and this is where you start to see that sectionalism start to arise again. Now, the sectionalism was always there; it never went away, although it was obviously overshadowed by nationalism during the era of good feelings. Uh, I will talk more about the distinct differences between the North and the West and the South. And I won't say a whole lot about the West because the West isn't that highly populated at this point, but I'll definitely talk about how the North and the South are developing differently during this time period. So one term that I probably should have introduced earlier, but I will introduce now, is the term antebellum. The term antebellum is Latin. It means before the war. And the antebellum period describes the time in American history before which war? The Civil War, as indicated by the picture on the slide. So the antebellum period simply means the time in American history before the Civil War. So basically, any time between the formation of the Constitution and the Civil War is usually referred to as the antebellum period. Different historians have different time frames for antebellum, but for me, I like to say it's basically the time between the creation of the United States under the Constitution and the Civil War itself. And during this time period, the North and the West and the South are going to develop and develop very differently. Now, I will say that even though the North and the West are different, they will be very closely tied economically uh, because of the internal improvements that I talked about before. The South will be kind of the odd man out in this situation, even though the South is tied to the North because of cotton and the textile mills in the North. You do see less of a connection between the North and the rest of the country. In other words, the North and the West are more unified with each other. The South, again, is kind of the odd man out in the grand scheme of things. So if you look at the lecture notes, you'll see that I'm going to talk about the North for the majority of the front side. I'll talk more about urbanization. I'll talk more about the effects of industrialization, what it's like to actually live and work in these factories that I was describing earlier. I'll speak briefly about the West, and the West will be a bigger theme later on in American history, not as much right now. And then when I get to the back side of the lecture, I'll talk a lot about life in the South, and I'll specifically talk a lot about what it's like to be a slave in the South during this time. So let's talk about the North first. Remember that in the North, there were farms, but the farms were not nearly as productive as they would be in the western part of the country or as they would be in the southern plantations. Why is that? Well, one is because the climate in the north is colder. The growing season is shorter, the overall temperatures are lower, and so it's not very conducive to growing crops. On top of that, the soil itself is not nearly as fertile as it is in the west or in the south. It's much rockier, it's much sandier. Uh, it doesn't have as much nutrients or as many nutrients as you would see in the western part of the country or the southern part of the country. There are other reasons why farming is going to struggle to continue in the north. One of those reasons is going to be the fact that the northern population is going to skyrocket. And if the northern population skyrockets, that means that there is less land to go around per person. So even if you wanted in the north to create a farm, because the population is so high, the value of land is going to go up because everyone's wanting this land, and you're not going to be able to afford to have a big farm. So basically, it's too crowded in the northern part of the country, the New England area especially, to create big farms. And remember that farms at this point, if they're going to be profitable, the ones that are profitable are the ones that have the steel plows, or the ones that have the mechanical reapers, or the ones out west. So even if you wanted to have a farm in the north, in the New England area, you're going to struggle to compete with the farms out west that are growing because of the new technologies that I talked about in the last lecture. So in the end, farming is going to be declining in the northern part of the country, in the New England area, in the New York area. And if you are one of these small farmers, you have basically one of two options. You could, if you want to, move out west, and some did, to where the soil is more fertile, to where the land is cheaper, to where there's less competition for the land because there are fewer people out there. You could buy some steel plows and mechanical reapers, and you could start a big farm out in the western part of the country. And some farmers did do that. If you look at the notes, you can see from the box that says result number 1, I have an arrow that points to something much further down about life in the West. I'll come back to that later. First, though, I'll talk about the other result of the decline of farming in the North, and that result is that some people abandoned farming altogether, and they decided to move to the cities and work in factories. And now factories were not pleasant. I'll talk more about how factory conditions were later on, but it proved economically to be an alternative to a lot of people in the North. It was another way to make money when farming went to decline. If you weren't so much a farmer and you're more of a blacksmith or a shoemaker, well, your job has already kind of gone away because you've been replaced by factory-made items. And again, I talked about how the factories kind of drove small home businesses out of business in the last lecture. So again, a lot of people, probably the majority of people in the North at this point, are going to abandon small-time farming and they're going to move into the cities. Some of them will move out west to start some large-scale farming. I'll talk more about that later. First, let's talk about the people that move into the cities to work in factories. So again, many of the farmers in the North, once farming was proving not to be that profitable, they're going to start moving into the cities. And there's going to be a problem here. The problem is that immigration is going to pick up around this time, especially after the War of 1812, especially in the later part of the Antebellum period, the time before the Civil War, like the 1840s or so. Immigration is going to pick up. Americans that were already here are going to be moving into the cities, and immigrants are also going to be moving into the cities. And they're not going to get along very well. There is a term that I'll talk about later on called nativism. Nativism means a dislike of immigrants, a dislike of foreigners, and throughout American history, and I'm not defending it, but throughout American history, nativism has been an issue. Throughout American history, Americans that were already in the country have oftentimes been hostile to those that were immigrants, those that were moving into the country for the first time. And what happens is that both the native-born Americans, the ones that were already here, and the immigrants are going to be both moving into the cities. So they're not going to exactly get along because of cultural differences, because of nativism, which again I'll expand upon later. They're not going to get along very well because of the cultural differences, but they're also not going to get along very well because they're going to be competing for the same jobs in the cities, in the factories. So that will become a big issue later on. At the time before the Civil War, most of your nativism, in other words, most of your anti-immigrant feeling is going to be kind of focused on German immigrants, but especially on the Irish. So we'll talk more about the Irish immigrants and the German immigrants at a later point. Overall, what is going to be the effect on cities? Cities are going to grow. And so when cities grow, whenever the country sees a growth in cities, that is known as urbanization. Urban means city, and urbanization basically means the transition of a society into having more cities and bigger cities. And this happens mainly in the northern part of the country. The South and the West had very little in terms of urbanization. The North, by far, is going to lead the country in urbanization during this time. And there's going to be a problem with that too, beyond the tension between Americans and immigrants. And that tension has kind of always existed. The other big problem is that the cities weren't really ready for this big population boom, and the cities are going to struggle to keep up with this population boom. And so if you look at the notes, you'll see that there are two arrows that come off of this box. We'll talk about the left-hand side first, the problems with urbanization, and then I'll talk about factory conditions. So one of the problems with urbanization is going to be overcrowding. Basically, a lot of people are going to be moving into the same area at the same time, and the cities are going to struggle to adjust to this population boom. Both Americans are going to be moving into the city and to the cities, and the immigrants are going to be moving into the cities around the same time, and it's going to be crowded. And when things are crowded, people are uncomfortable and people are not going to be as pleasant. They're not going to get along as well, especially if there are already existing cultural differences. So you have tension in the cities because of the overcrowding, but that tension is going to be especially strong between Americans and immigrants that are moving in. And I told you that the Germans and the Irish are the main two immigrant groups that are going to be moving in. The Irish are the ones that really move into the cities. So if there's going to be one kind of main target of nativism, of anti-immigrant feeling, it would be the Irish. The Germans face nativism as well, but the Irish face it the worst. More on that later. Another problem with urbanization is going to be crime. You have a lot of people living in the same area at the same time, and a lot of the time they are working in factories that don't pay them very much at all, so you have a lot of people living in poverty. And so you do see a rise in crime. Poverty and crime go hand in hand. When people are poor and they're desperate, they're more likely to commit crimes. And so what's interesting is that you didn't really have police departments before urbanization took hold. Once you have large populations living in a concentrated area, you're going to see the need for police officers and you'll see the need for police departments. Something similar is going to happen in relation to fire departments. So this is before the time of steel being a big deal. This is before the time where the cities were really built out of steel. They were built out of wood. And so basically you had this problem that if one house or one building catches on fire, then the fire is going to spread very quickly throughout the city. So you will also have a fire danger associated with urbanization. You have lots of wooden buildings that are very near each other, and if one catches on fire, the fire spreads very quickly. So you will also see the development of your first fire departments. So urbanization leads to the creation of police departments and fire departments. Official organizations meant to do policing or meant to do firefighting. The next problem with urbanization is a kind of a biological problem, and that is that when people all move into the same area at the same time, they are going to bring diseases with them, and if you're in a city, diseases can spread pretty quickly. But there's another problem, and that is that everyone that has ever lived has to use the bathroom. Now, if you lived out in the farming areas beforehand, you probably had an outhouse where you could use the bathroom. If you live in a city, where are you going to use the bathroom? And if you use the bathroom, say you do it in a bucket, which was common back then, what do you do with that bucket? And this picture is actually from a later time period, but it gets the point across. In the end, basically, without sewers, you're going to see human waste start to build up in the streets. Imagine what that street's going to be like if a rainstorm comes through. On top of this, this was before the time of cars. So if people are going to travel, they're going to use horses and buggies, and horses also produce waste. And where's that waste going to end up? Also in the streets. So sanitation overall is a major issue in the cities. There, especially early on, before sewer systems were put in place, there was no place to put this human waste, and people were literally dumping their human waste out of windows. And of course, the horses were using the bathroom whenever they saw fit in the streets. So the cities were nasty, they smelled terrible, they were very unsanitary, and again, this is just going to increase the spread of diseases. So both human and animal waste and trash are going to be rotting in the streets. There was not, basically, sanitation systems came later. The sanitation systems were not able to keep up with the population growth, and it was nasty for a while. Now, obviously, eventually sewer systems will be created, sanitation departments will also be created, just like police and fire departments, to help deal with this problem. But initially, sanitation is a major issue in the northern cities. There's also going to be a negative impact of urbanization on families. Remember that when people moved to the cities, they moved to the cities and they brought their families to the cities, which were already overcrowded. There was crime and there was fire danger and there were sanitation issues. Uh, Remember that these families are also moving into a place where factory work is the main source of work. And at the time, the men were the ones that typically worked in the factories. I will talk about women that worked in factories. I will talk about children that worked in factories a little bit later on. But overall, it was men that worked in factories. And when they left the home to work in the factories, they're going to be working for very long hours, maybe 10 hours a day, maybe 12 hours a day, maybe even more than that. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of strain in the families because they're not with each other as much. Remember, before this happened, if you worked, say, as a blacksmith or as a small farmer, you were working around the house all day long if you were a male, and you would be close to the family. You'd be close to your wife, you'd be close to your children. Now men are leaving their families for sometimes over half of the day to go work in factories, and this factory work was not pleasant, so they're going to come home and they're going to probably be tired, they may be in a bad mood, and oftentimes these poor working conditions depressed these workers so much that they would turn to alcohol as a way to cope. And so you start to see the abuse of alcohol increase during urbanization and industrialization. So this is one of the negative impacts of urbanization and industrialization is the increase of alcohol abuse. And obviously, this is going to be bad for families. You would have men come home, they would either already be drunk or they would begin drinking, and then they would maybe abuse their wives, abuse their children. They may be spending what little money they had on alcohol if they became addicted, and they would be spending the family's money on alcohol. And so, overall, alcohol abuse is going to be hurting families. Why am I bringing that up? Because eventually there is going to be a reform movement meant to tackle the alcohol abuse problem. It'll be called the temperance movement, where you'll see a lot of people, especially women, and remember, women were oftentimes the victims of abusive husbands. You'll see women lead this crusade to try to get people to drink less. In American history, too, you'll learn about how this movement becomes even more aggressive and more militant, and you'll have a time period known as Prohibition during the 1920s, where the government actually, the federal government, makes alcohol pretty much illegal. And then you'll learn about how the government struggled to enforce that law, and ultimately it proved to be unenforceable. But just keep in mind that the issue of alcohol abuse is very present in the early American history, and the Irish and the Germans, whenever they came over, those immigrants came over, both of their cultures were very permissive when it came to alcohol use, and that just contributes to the alcohol abuse problem in the country. Statistically, Americans drank about 3 times as much in the antebellum period as they do today, if that tells you anything about how much people were drinking back then. So alcohol abuse was a serious problem that needed to be dealt with. More on that issue later on. Now let's go on to what it's like to work in the factories. Why are people in the factories turning to alcohol as a way to blow off steam? And you'll probably get this, you'll get your answer here in a second. So let's move on to the right-hand column where it says factory conditions. Again, if you look at the picture there, you can see what an antebellum factory would have looked like. The relationship between the bosses, the owners of these factories, and the workers was usually pretty negative. Before this time period, if you wanted to get a job in manufacturing, if you wanted to be a blacksmith, you would work under an existing blacksmith. You would become an apprentice to the blacksmith, and the blacksmith would almost be like a father figure to you. And so there was a very close relationship there between the master and the apprentice. In the factories, however, if you have a factory that has 100+ workers in it, maybe like the factory that you see pictured there, the bosses might not even know the names of the workers. And so the relationship is going to be very impersonal. It's going to be, in fact, very negative oftentimes. And oftentimes the owners of these factories would look at the workers as just another piece of machinery, which means that if you can't work, then you just get fired. If you break your arm or you get your arm ripped off in one of these machines, then you just get fired. Again, the relationship is going to be very negative. Oftentimes, the workers were seen as just another part of the machinery. The workers also worked for very long hours. There was no such thing as overtime paid during this time. There was no such thing as overtime, period. If I remember correctly, the average work week would have been around 60 hours a week. And today, the average work day is around, or work week is around 40 hours a week. So people worked very long hours. Usually it was 6 days a week. They might have Sundays off, but Sundays only off, and they would work for very low wages. There was no such thing as minimum wage at this point. And if you didn't like your working conditions, if you didn't like your pay in the North, well, you just go to the factory next door, and guess what? The hours and the wages are probably going to be about the same. Also, conditions were unsafe. Like I said before, you could get your arm ripped off in one of the machines. If you look at this machine here, uh, that does not look very safe. There's not any kind of thing to guard you from getting caught in this machinery. If you look here, you can see a belt that's probably spinning very quickly. If you get your part of your body caught in that, it's probably going to be ripped off. So again, there's very little consideration given to safety, very little consideration given to sanitation, very little consideration given to heating during the winter or cooling during the summer. And why is that? Well, if you had to worry about safety, if you have to worry about sanitation, if you have to worry about making the conditions better, then that's going to cost money, and the owners of these factories were not willing to pay that money. And they would basically say to their workers, well, if you don't like these conditions, go work somewhere else. But there was no real alternative if you were going to do factory work in the cities. And you can see why some people decided to move to the western farms instead. One of the classic examples of the northern factories will be the Lowell Mill system. This happened in Massachusetts. So the Lowell Mill system describes a system of textile mills that existed largely in the New England area, and they employed single women and children. If a woman was married, the role of the woman then was socially to go to the home, be a mother, be a homemaker, and not to be working. But if women were single, they oftentimes would be used as workers, and they would be paid less than men. And also, and this is terrible to say, but it's true, is that oftentimes the factories would use children. They would even go into orphanages sometimes and find children that didn't have parents and then use these children for cheap labor that they would pay even less than the men and the women. So the Lowell Mill system is the classic example of, if you will, the abuses of industrialization during the antebellum period. Now, in the Lowell Mill system specifically, these female workers especially lived in dormitories that were built around the mill. So they basically worked in the textile mill, and then they went next door to live uh, in dormitories. And so basically, you have what's known as a company town being where basically the factory owns or the factory owners own the factory itself, but also the living quarters for the workers. So in a sense, your entire life is going to be controlled by the factory that you're working for. In fact, especially the women are going to be strictly controlled. Their movements are going to be controlled. They go and they work in the factory for many hours a day, sometimes 12 hours, maybe even more. I may assign a primary source activity where you read about some of these conditions. They work very long hours, and then whenever they're not working, they're living in dormitories. They're usually going to be escorted to the dorms and back to the factories the next day. They have very little freedom unless they got married and then went back to the home to be wives and mothers. But they are going to be very tightly controlled. They are going to work very long hours, and in the end, they are also going to be paid less than men. Discrimination in terms of pay was common during this time period. And of course, the conditions were bad for men as well. They were just worse for women and even worse for children. And again, I see this as a form of child abuse, child labor. These children would be sometimes as young as maybe 5 years old, and they would not be able to go to school because they are working. And if they're not able to go to school, then they're going to basically never have a skill that gets them out of the factory, and the factory basically owns them from cradle to grave. So, to sum it all up, working conditions are terrible. Long hours, low pay, not safe, not sanitary, very little time for breaks. In fact, if you were one of the low class people working in these factories, your life expectancy actually went down. People were working themselves to death. That being said, as bad as it was for the men, it was even worse for the women, and of course, even worse for the children that had to work in these conditions. So, if you're one of these factory workers, you're probably going to get fed up eventually, and you might decide to form a union. So, some workers decide to form labor unions where they would get together and they would use their power and numbers to try to demand better working conditions. However, the general American public looked down upon these workers. A lot of Americans they looked at these low class workers as being immoral people, bad people, people that needed to be working 12 hours a day because if they didn't, then they would be doing something else that was bad. They said that if they had too much free time, they might do uh, bad things, and this kind of relates back to the Puritan roots of the northern part of the country. Remember, there was this idea that if you were doing what God wanted, then things would go well for you. If you're not doing what God wanted, then things would go bad for you. And you see that really in the perception of the lower class factory workers. There was this idea that the reason that these people are working in these poor jobs where they have bad conditions is because for some reason or another they don't have God's favor. They must not be doing what God wants. They must be immoral in some way. So public perception of these workers was bad. They were seen as immoral oftentimes, and so whenever these people tried to form unions, they were often the unions were oftentimes seen as bad, if not illegal in some of the states. Now, eventually, there will be a little glimmer of hope for labor unions, and that will be a state Supreme Court case. The state Supreme Court of Massachusetts is going to come out with a ruling. This is known as Commonwealth versus Hunt, and it's going to say that unions are legal so long as they're peaceful. So during the antebellum period, unions don't see much success because they are perceived as being bad or as illegal. But by the end of the antebellum period, there is a state Supreme Court case that gives them some legitimacy, but you won't really hear much more about the union movement or any successes for the unions until American history too. So for the time being, just know that the factories are growing during this time. The economy is growing during this time, but the economy is growing largely due to the efforts of poor, abused workers, sometimes even children in the factories. Regardless, factories are growing, even if it's at the expense of the poor Americans at the time. Factories were growing. And you can see now why moving out west might be an alternative that people would seek, but there are problems with moving out west as well. So if you look now, we're going to talk very briefly about life in the West. And the reason that it's brief is because not a lot of people are moving out west until a little bit later on, but there are still some because of the internal improvements that we talked about before. So, out west, if you were living out there, you're going to probably be a farmer. Most people living in the western part of the country were farmers. Farming was common. There were a lot larger pieces of land available, a lot more acreage available. The land was more fertile, and people also had the tools like steel plows, like mechanical reapers to uh, plant and harvest crops. However, it was difficult. So, the psychological impact is that you're going to be very isolated. If you're living on a large plot of land, you're probably not going to have a neighbor very close by. You're going to be isolated. You're going to be lonely. If something goes wrong, you're going to have to take care of it yourself because there's probably, like, for example, if you break your leg, there's probably not a doctor nearby. So, you or a family member are going to have to take care of that. So, there are a lot of problems with living out west. And of course, the further out west you go, the more likely you are to come into conflict with Native Americans. Now, even though Native Americans don't have the help of the British anymore after the War of 1812, you still will have conflict with Native Americans, especially. Basically, the more out west you go, the more conflict you might see with Native Americans, especially if you go on the other side of the Mississippi River. So that will be a problem. Overall, even though you're not being tightly controlled in a factory and having to work in the terrible factory conditions, you will still have rough farming conditions as well. So life wasn't easy during this time period, no matter where you lived, unless you were one of the wealthy Americans in society. Keep in mind also, though, that these farmers are going to be connected to the cities because whatever they're producing, whether it be corn, whether it be wheat, whether they be raising cattle, they're going to need internal improvements. They're going to need things like the National Road. They're going to need things like the Erie Canal. They're going to need things like railroads to deliver their products to the very many hungry mouths in the northern cities. So as the cities grow in population, there's going to be more mouths to feed, and the farmers in the West will be able to provide that so long as the internal improvements, in other words, the infrastructure, the roads, the canals, the railroads, so long as that brings their product to the city, they can make a living. So keep in mind again this connection between the West and the North. It really ties them together. And when the Civil War happens, the New England area and the northwestern area of the country and even the far western area of the country are going to be united together, and it's going to be all of them basically versus the South during the Civil War. Speaking of the South, let's talk about what life was like in the South. And so the rest of this lecture will be talking about life in the South, and I'll especially emphasize what life was like for slaves, which made up almost half of the Southern population. So remember, I said in the previous lecture what the Cotton gin did for slavery. It basically saved slavery and actually helped slavery become profitable and helped slavery expand. You're going to see slavery expand throughout the South all the way towards the Mississippi River, ultimately all the way to Texas. And by the way, Texas is not part of the United States at this point. Texas is part of Mexico. I'll talk about Texas getting its independence later on. But remember that cotton is going to be cotton growing and slavery will be spreading throughout the South during the antebellum period. And by the time of the Civil War, there's about, I think it's 3.95 million slaves. So basically, about 4 million slaves are going to be in the southern part of the United States by the time the Civil War begins, which is a very significant number because the entire population of the South was about 9 million. So 44% or so of the South was enslaved. In a land, and let me make that point again, about almost half of the South will be enslaved by the time of the Civil War. And this is happening in a country whose founding documents say things like that all men are created equal and that people are endowed to natural rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is a big piece of hypocrisy in our early American history, is that while we said that all people are created equal, and while we said that people are endowed with natural rights like life, liberty, property, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the southern part of the country was enslaving almost half of its population in an area that was supposed to be the land of the free. Okay, so we'll go to the, you'll see from this box, you see two arrows, one pointing to the left, one pointing to the right. We'll go to the one on the left first. So the South ends up earning a nickname, the Cotton Kingdom. Why is it called the Cotton Kingdom? It's because, if you will, cotton was king in the South. If you were going to make a living, you're going to make a living based off of growing cotton. Either, if you were white, you would either be growing the cotton yourself, or you would be using slaves to help grow the cotton. And if you look at the maps here, these maps use color coding to show you the percentage of each area that was enslaved. And you can see this top map is from right after the War of 1812. This bottom map is from right before the Civil War. And you can see, if you look at this color here, you can see that I'm pointing at, you can see that much of the South was over half enslaved, especially South Carolina, especially areas near the Mississippi River. So if you were in the South and you were a slave owner, you wanted to keep slavery around, you wanted to expand slavery further west as much as you could. And what ends up happening is what a lot of these slave owners, what they do is they're going to start creating these big slave plantations that grow cotton year in and year out, and they start to wear out the soil, and they start to need new soil. Where are you going to get that new soil? Further out west. So you are going to see a need for the Southerners to expand slavery westward eventually all the way to Texas. Now, over time, by the time you get to the Civil War, the northern states, and you can see that there's no slavery up here if you're looking at the map, the northern states don't want slavery to expand out west. And again, I'm bringing up that issue of tension between the North and the South over the issue of slavery, but more specifically over the expansion of slavery in the West. So again, keep in mind that over time, the southern states are going to want to allow slavery to expand west. The northern states are not going to want slavery to expand west, and that will be one of the major causes of the American Civil War. I keep bringing that up. Again, we will get to the Civil War, and we'll spend plenty of time on the Civil War, which is basically the focal point of American History 1. Now let's go on to the right-hand side, and you may be asking yourself, why didn't the South start building factories? If you're a factory owner, you're making lots of money, so why didn't the South industrialize? Well, the reason is because the wealthy planter class, the people that owned the most land and had the most money and had the big plantations, they already had lots of money. They already had lots of economic influence. They had a lot of land. They had a lot of political influence. And since they were already making their money off of slavery and off of cotton, they really didn't see a need to change their money source. It would take a lot of effort to start building factories. They'd have to start pulling their money together and form corporations to build factories. And so they had very little interest in building factories overall because basically they could make their money off the plantations and then sell their cotton to the already in place factories in the north, to the textile mills in the north. So in the end, even though it was possible to build factories in the South, and even though there were some factories built in the South, especially textile mills, overall, Southern society is going to be largely based off of cotton production. If you are a wealthy planter, you're going to be using slaves. If you are a less wealthy farmer, you will maybe own one or two slaves and that's it. You may own no slaves at all, but even if you are a poor white that has no money to own slaves, you're still going to probably make your money off of cotton. So in the end, Southern society is going to be almost exclusively based off of cotton. Tobacco is still being grown, indigo is still being grown, rice is still being grown, but because of the cotton gin, cotton becomes the cash crop of the South. There are other cash crops, but by far, at this point, the dominant cash crop, because of the cotton gin and because of the free labor source, slavery to pick it, you will see cotton become the big cash crop in the South. Okay, so let's talk about what Southern society was like. One thing that is very noteworthy and very surprising to a lot of people is the fact that by far the majority of whites did not own slaves in the South. Slaves were expensive. Most people did not have the money to be able to afford slaves. If I remember correctly, only about a quarter or about 1/4 of whites in the South owned slaves, and even then, the vast majority owned only one or two. So typically, whenever you think about the stereotypes of the South during this time, you think about these big plantations that have hundreds of slaves working on them. That was the exception. That was not the rule. Most people, by far, did not own slaves, and even if they did not own many. However, if you were a white Southerner, even if you did not own slaves, you still supported slavery. Why did you do this? Partly because of racism. Partly because it kept, if you were a poor white, you were not very high up on the social ladder, but if you're a poor white, you could say to yourself, well, at least I'm not a black slave. So it kept you from being at the bottom of the social ladder. And there was this kind of, if you will, a twisted American dream that if you saved up your money, maybe one day, even if you're a poor white, you could own a slave of your own. Okay, so let's talk about Southern society. If you look at this kind of triangle here, you can see the rankings of the different social groups, and you can kind of see the relative size of the different social groups. So if you look at the top part of the triangle, you'll see where most of the power and the land control was and the money was, and that would be among the wealthy planters. They were the smallest group in terms of population. Most people were not wealthy planters. Most people could not afford to have a plantation with 100 plus slaves on it. But they did have the most money, they did have the most land, and they did have the most power. At this point, if you wanted to vote, a lot of times your voting privilege was dependent on how much land you owned. So the wealthy planters pretty much dominated in the South, at least at the early part of the antebellum period. Eventually, you'll see some changes made in qualifications to vote, and you'll see the land and property qualifications get reduced or dropped. More on that later on. But again, the wealthy planter class will be the smallest group in terms of number, but by far they have the most money, they have the most power, they have the most land, and they have the most slaves. Now, if you look at the chart, you'll see that the biggest group, or one of the biggest groups, will be what's known as the yeoman farmers, which is basically another word for small farmers. This will be the biggest group. Most people were small farmers. They might own slaves, but if they did, they owned very few. 2 to 4 slaves probably. They don't have a lot of money. They grow enough cotton or other crops to basically sustain themselves, but not a whole lot more. They might be able to sell a little bit for profit, but they're not going to be very wealthy. This will be kind of like lower middle class people, your yeoman farmers. So this will be the largest group. They won't own slaves, or excuse me, they might own slaves, but if they do, they don't own very many, and they have very little power. Now, what's interesting to note is that these small farmers, if they only own 1 or 2 slaves, they're actually probably going to get to know their slaves. They'll know their names. They'll probably work in the fields with them because they have to get by, and they actually had a fairly decent relationship with the slaves. I'm not saying that slavery was good. These slaves were still being denied their basic natural right of freedom, but they were treated much more humanely than you would have seen on the big plantations. It's on the big plantations where you would have seen the whippings and the psychological torture that you may have seen in movies. But with the yeoman farmers, with the small farmers, the relationship between the farmers and the slaves would have been much more personal. Even if the slaves are being denied their freedom, they would have been treated a little bit more humanely. And the next part, and that question mark should not be there on the notes, but basically the poor whites are going to own very little land. They're not going to be able to afford slaves at all, but they will still support slavery due to racism. Again, leave that question mark off of your notes. The reason that they support slavery is because, one, they could tell themselves, well, I might be a poor white. I might be, quote, poor white trash, which I believe was a term even back then. But they could say to themselves, even if I'm a poor white, at least I'm not black. So at least I'm not at the bottom of the social ladder. So racism does play into this. Also, these poor whites maybe had this dream of eventually having slaves of their own. And so that would kind of keep them going and again, keep them supporting slavery because maybe even if they aren't slave owners now, they might be slave owners someday, and that would for them be a step up on the social ladder. Now, what's interesting is that there were actually some free blacks in the South. How did they become free? Well, remember that blacks were considered, slaves were considered to be property in the South, and property can be bought and sold. And what some of these slaves would do in their very little free time, because they usually work from dawn till dusk, but if they were willing and able, they might work during the night to try to grow a little bit of crops of their own, maybe raise a cow or a pig, or maybe start doing some sort of manufacturing, like maybe they would start making horse saddles, things like that. Some slaves would do side jobs to earn money, and it might take them 10 years, it might take them longer, but they would earn a little bit of money, and some of these slaves were actually able to save up enough money to buy their own freedom. So you do see a small segment of the southern population that was black and free. These free men and women tended to live in cities where the racism still existed, but it wasn't quite as bad as you might have seen in the rural areas and the plantations. Interesting side note is that some of these freemen got so much money once they were free that they were able to afford slaves. And guess what? Every once in a while, you do see this situation pop up where you see black slave owners. That was definitely the exception, not the rule. Now, at the very bottom of Southern society will be the slaves themselves. And if you look at the triangle that shows the social hierarchy of the South, you'll see a big section at the bottom with an arrow pointed to it coming off of a major chart. We're about to get into that chart. That'll be the slave population at the very bottom. So if you look at the chart, look at the oval in the middle, and in the middle you put the word slavery. Keep it simple. Everything that I'm going to talk about in this chart is going to be about slavery. So in the middle oval again, put the word slavery. And I'll talk about different aspects of slavery. The first thing I'll talk about is controlling slaves, keeping slavery going. And that's going to happen with slave codes. So once you've got slavery in the middle oval, go to the upper left, and then we're going to go to the upper right, then to the bottom left, and then to the bottom right. Okay, so slave codes. What was the purpose of slave codes? The slave codes were put in place to control slaves, keep them from being able to rebel, keep them from having the power or the knowledge to be able to rebel. And so slaves were often unable to own any kind of property, or they were very limited in their property ownership. They were definitely not allowed to own guns, which would be a violation in many people's minds of the Second Amendment. Why were they not allowed to own guns? Well, because where do you think they would point their guns if they had them? Probably at the slave owners. And again, this wasn't seen as a constitutional violation of their rights because they weren't seen as people, they weren't seen as citizens, they were seen as property, and property has no rights to ownership. So they weren't allowed to own guns. If there was a trial, they were not allowed to testify in this trial against a white person, because if a black person can testify against a white person, it kind of symbolizes almost power of a black person over a white person, and that was considered a big no-no at the time. The idea was you had to keep whites on top and blacks on the bottom. The final thing is a big deal. They were not allowed to learn how to read and write. They were not allowed to become literate. Why were they not allowed to become literate? Why couldn't they read and write? Because there's a phrase that you've probably heard of, knowledge is power, and basically if they could read and write, they could become more educated. If they became more educated, they might become more aware of how bad their conditions were, and it might motivate them to try to seek freedom. Additionally, if they wanted to organize any kind of rebellion and they could read and write, then they could use the passage of notes to each other to organize rebellion. So all of these rules, and there were others, but all the rules that are listed here were meant to keep the slaves at the bottom of society and basically neuter any of their possible attempts to rebel against their conditions. So again, the purpose of the slave codes were, one, to keep the slaves at the bottom of Southern society, and also to keep them basically too ignorant to be able to rebel. Now remember that ignorant does not mean stupid. Ignorant means that you just don't know things. So they were deliberately denied an education, even though they were capable of being educated. And there were a few that secretly became educated, like Frederick Douglass, who I'll talk about later on. But they were deliberately kept from education because the more educated they got, the more likely they were to see the badness of their conditions, the more likely they were to want to rebel, the more likely they would be able to try to rebel. So they were deliberately kept ignorant to keep them from being able to rebel. And by the way, anytime there's a rebellion, and that's interesting, despite all these slave codes, you will see rebellions. And every time you see a rebellion, you see a tightening of the slave codes. You see even more slave codes put in place. We'll talk more about that later on. So what was it like to be a slave working in these conditions? Slaves, again, were viewed as property. They were oftentimes treated as property. And honestly, being treated as property is almost a good thing during this time, because if someone owns a piece of property, they want to take care of their property. And so the stereotype is that slaves got whipped relentlessly. That's not entirely true. People did not want to whip their slaves if they could help it, and this is kind of morbid to say, but the reason why you didn't, if you're a white slave owner, why you didn't whip your slave is because if you whip your slave and you leave scars on their back, it's going to hurt their resale value. It would be the equivalent of a farmer getting mad at a tractor today and then slashing that tractor's tires and taking a sledgehammer to the engine. So slaves, because they were treated as property, they actually had financial value to the slave owners, and so they physically would not be hurt nearly as often as you might think, even though there were obviously whippings that took place. There were physical punishments that took place. Uh, but not quite as often as one would think. They are going to be worked very hard. They are going to be worked from dawn until dusk. Typically, they would get, I believe, 3 days off a year, and I believe they would get, they might get Sundays off. In terms of full days off, beyond Sundays, they might get 3 days off around Christmas, but that would be about it. During the warmer months in the South, they would be working in the fields, and during the colder months, even if they weren't working in the fields, the owners of the slaves might be hiring out the slaves to do other kinds of work besides cotton-related work. Okay, so again, what's going to motivate the slaves to go along with this system? Because obviously this is a terrible system that no one would want to live under. So how do you motivate the slaves? Well, one is you could punish them, like you see on this picture on the right here. Look how scarred this man's back is. Physical punishment could be used, but it was not usually the first priority, because if you view slaves as property, you want to keep their value up. And this slave, if this slave was up for sale, this slave would be seen as probably a rebellious slave, and that's why they are so scarred up, because they've been punished so much, and they would not be very easy to sell. I'm not trying to dehumanize the slaves. I'm speaking from the point of view of the slave owners when I say these things. There were other kinds of physical punishment that would be uncomfortable but wouldn't leave scars. For example, you might have a piece of metal stuck into your mouth and then kind of kept in place there by some sort of muzzle. I think that was known as having the bit put on you. And you might have that piece of metal in your mouth for a week, and that would be very uncomfortable, and you wouldn't like that. If you tried to run away, they might attach a ring collar around your neck, and then from that collar, they might have three very long spikes sticking up, each with a bell on it, so that if you tried to run away, you would not be able to keep all three bells. Even if you have two hands, you're not going to be able to keep all three bells from ringing, and so that would keep you from being able to run away. But imagine trying to sleep wearing a collar like that, and you might be wearing that for a month or more. So there were physical punishments that did not leave scars that would still be used. However, the most effective kind of punishment, the most effective way to keep slaves in line, would be to use the threat of the auction block. And that's what you see on the right or on the left-hand side. Slaves would be auctioned off as property. If you look at this picture carefully, you can see that there is a family, a man, a woman, and a child that are all being auctioned. And this is very tragic. This is very sad, but oftentimes the husband would be sold to one owner, the wife would be sold to another owner, and the child to a third. So slave auctions often took place. They often separated families, and if your family was separated at the auction block, that separation was almost guaranteed to be permanent. If your family member was sold off, you were almost guaranteed to never see them again. There were rules in place that said that if a child was too young, they could not be sold off till a certain age, but that rule is often ignored. And there are very tragic times in American history where you saw young children being ripped from their mother's arms at the auction block. And if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, there is a scene in that movie that shows a woman being separated from her child, and that was actually based off a real event that happened. So why am I bringing that up? One is to bring up how bad slavery could be, but also think how effective of a control tool this would be. You would behave and obey your master because you knew that if you didn't obey your master might sell you off to another plantation, and then you'd be separated from pretty much the only thing that you had in this life, which was your family. So that is going to be much more motivating for some slaves to stay in line than a whip, than any kind of physical punishment. The threat of being separated from your family at the auction block. And I do have a primary source activity that talks about the slave conditions that I'll probably assign. Okay, so what was it like for the slaves themselves? What was slave culture like? So now let's go to the bottom left. Because the slaves had so little, they pretty much had the clothes. Actually, they owned pretty much nothing. They did not own their shelter, that was the master's. They did not own their clothing, that was the master's. So what did they have? They had each other. So within slave culture, families are going to be very strong. When people have very little, they feel to live for, families are going to be what you lean on. So the family structure is going to be very strong. They are going to need each other. They are going to love each other because, again, that is pretty much all that they had. Another part of slave culture, and this was kind of a subtle form sometimes of fighting against the slave owners, is going to be the use of song. So while working out in the fields, oftentimes slaves would sing songs. Oftentimes these songs would be religious because religion would give them hope. Oftentimes these songs had hidden meanings in the lyrics to either maybe insult the slave owner or maybe talk about freedom, but talk about it in code, because if you talked about freedom openly, you'd probably be punished. And sometimes these songs would talk about running away and trying to escape slavery. There was one song about following the drinking gourd, and the drinking gourd was basically if I remember correctly, the Big Dipper. And basically, if you escaped and tried to run away from slavery, if you followed the Big Dipper at the right time of year, then you would, when you were running during the night, you would find yourself in the north eventually. So again, songs are going to be a big part of culture, and also religion, specifically Christianity. Now, why is it Christianity? Well, one is that Christianity has historically been the dominant religion in the United States. But what happened was slave owners would take Christianity and they would cherry pick certain verses from the Bible to basically support slavery as a good thing. And if you take certain Bible verses out of context, you could support slavery. Of course, if you put them in their context, then the slavery argument goes away. But if you cherry pick verses, you could support slavery. So, in fact, the slave owners wanted their slaves to be Christians because then they could give them a warped version of Christianity that would support slavery. Beyond that, though, Christianity in general, beyond the parts that were cherry picked to support slavery, Christianity will be very important for a lot of these slaves because it gave them hope. They might not have a good life now, but through their faith, they could foresee and hope for a future, a better future in the next life. Now, despite the fact that there were slave codes, despite the fact that people were being worked very hard to the point where they were exhausted, despite the fact that they were threatened with physical punishment, and despite the fact that slaves were threatened with being separated from their families, you did see resistance. And you will, and that's very important to note, is that despite the deck being so stacked against the slaves in so many ways, they still resisted, which speaks to just how bad their conditions were. So how did they resist? Well, one way that they could resist without the owners even knowing would be to sabotage equipment. You take a cotton gin and you take a couple screws out of the cotton gin and all of a sudden it doesn't work, and then you might not have to work for a few hours. And even though ultimately you're still going to be a slave and you're still going to have to do work eventually, this was a passive way to kind of stick it to your slave owner and at least get a little bit of a fight back, and without the slave owner actually realizing it. And if the slave owner thought that you had sabotaged the equipment, then you'd be open to punishment, so you had to be careful about this. Sometimes they would engage in what's known as a work slowdown. They would work as slowly as possible. And you may, you may, as a student, have done this for teachers that you aren't a big fan of. You might have said, "Well, I'm doing my work," but you do your work as slowly as possible because you don't like the work that you're doing. But so long as you keep doing it, you'll do it. You'll keep the teacher off your back, and that's kind of what these slaves are doing. Is they would engage in these work slowdowns where they would work as slowly as possible without the owners realizing that they were doing the work as slow as possible, and that was again a passive way to resist. Another thing you might do is if you were a slave in the plantation house, you might spit in your master's food. You might poison your master's food. But again, you always had to be careful with this passive resistance because if you got caught, you would be open to punishment. The very famous form of resistance would be running away. Slaves would run away oftentimes, and eventually you see the creation of the informal Underground Railroad. You see the Underground Railroad pictured here. Uh, and the Underground Railroad again was an informal system that got people out of the South, got slaves out of the South. You might escape to Mexico, like down here in this part of the map. You might escape to parts of Florida that were swampy and hard to, where you would be hard to find. Maybe live with some of the Seminoles, or you might escape even further south to the Caribbean islands. But most famously, you go north. Now, at one point, going to a northern state would have been enough to get you your freedom, but eventually there will be a law called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and even then, or after that, even the northern states will not be safe, and you'll have to move all the way to Canada. Running away was not easy, though. When you ran away, slave owners did not want to lose their property. Slaves were worth thousands of dollars. They would send bounty hunters after you. They would send bloodhounds after you. So this was not an easy trek, and you're doing this on foot for the most part. I'll talk more about the Underground Railroad later on. Now, sometimes when slaves rebelled, they rebelled violently, and this would be a very bold move. Because if the slaves rebelled violently, then the punishment would be severe. It would not be a whipping. It would not be a selling off of a family member. You would probably be tortured and killed, probably in sight of other slaves, as an example. So, however, uh, despite the bad conditions, despite the very low probability of success, you did see slaves attempt to rebel every once in a while. We talked about the Stono Rebellion during the colonial period. I will talk about Nat Turner's rebellion later on. More specifically, I'll get into the details of Nat Turner's rebellion. This is kind of a foreshadowing here. This is Nat Turner. He was a slave preacher, but what he was preaching was not Christianity. Well, he was preaching Christianity, but not Christianity only. He was also preaching rebellion, and he is going to orchestrate a major rebellion in the 1830s. I'll talk more about that, where he and his followers kill over 50 whites. More on that later on. The problem with slave rebellions is that they usually don't work. Now, in Haiti, there had been what was known as the Haitian Revolution, which you may have learned about in world history, where slaves had basically overthrown the masters in that country. In the United States, there never was a slave rebellion that proved ultimately successful. They always got stopped. But every time a slave rebellion did happen, you did see a tightening of the slave codes. So basically, every time slaves rebelled, the owners would look at what had happened and they would say, well, let's make the rules even stricter. So as time goes on through the antebellum period, you will see slave codes get stricter and stricter and stricter. Why? Because the southern white slave owners were getting more and more and more afraid of a slave rebellion. They were terrified of the fact that there might be a slave rebellion that ends up being successful or ended up being successful. And in fact, in some parts of the South, especially along the Mississippi River, especially in South Carolina, there were places where the slave population was twice that of the free population. And if a slave rebellion got out of hand, then the entire Southern system would fall apart. So you will see slave rebellions occur, but every time they occur, the slave codes get stricter and stricter as the slave owners get more and more afraid of these rebellions. Again, I will talk more about these rebellions later on in this course. I've gone ahead and foreshadowed it now, and that wraps up this lesson.